sharing one too. So. Tobias.
Yeah, thank you. Really, really interesting papers, and just picking up from what Catherine commented on, because it's something I'm writing on in a different context in migration, but thinking about this active and passive waiting and the importance of time, I think in all of your questions, and the way we talk about is about having ownership of time, or reclaiming ownership over time, rather than having someone else's time that you live under. And I think it's in one of your quotes, it's really clear where they say, well, if I have to live with this anyway, I might as well do something out of it. And related to that, again, maybe more of an observation of the question that where are the aspirations in I mean, your papers, they're quite clear, but in your others, is there a future orientation, or is it more of a kind of, is resilience and survival so important that there is planning or non-planning, you have kind of a resistance against other people's plans of what to do with the housing estate, but are there aspirations for what they want to do instead, or is that retaining the status quo? And in your case, is it survival, or how far are these aspirations of middle-classing yourself still present or undermined by what's going on? So how are different aspirations also of the future and of fitting in certain kinds of self narratives of class or aspirations?
Yeah, I've got a point just to add there from the chair, and that is, I noticed, Anna, that there was, in one of your people, she has a certain narrative of self-blame, because I think her husband left at some point, or maybe her partner, and so in a sense she seemed to be having a kind of inwardly directed notion that maybe she'd brought many of these problems upon herself. And I think I picked up something similar with what Jaime was saying, which is that the kind of tenor of your argument seemed to be that people who are kind of caught up in this whole financialization phenomenon are not very much aware of sort of structural forces acting upon them, but rather maybe they're inwardly directing some of the processes. So I'm assuming that maybe some of them, I mean, obviously your thing was quite abstract and you weren't citing specific people, but I was wondering how far some of those people also feel it's just about me, it's my mortgage, I must pay it off, and it's all about that kind of individualized responsibilization thing. And I felt like maybe in this process of sharing or listening, which you described, there was some kind of externalizing of these individualized processes and turning them into something a bit more communal, and maybe sharing the blame a bit. But then again, as you were saying, you got some people in your Aylesbury case who wouldn't actually go that far. They wouldn't actually share. So there's obviously limits to how far this kind of commoning process can actually go.
Yeah, Joanna.
Can I ask a question, just kind of following off those two as well? Like Anna and Matt, with your papers, I really liked how they both overcame a tendency in kind of public and media representations of council estates in the UK to be either sites of social isolation or kind of hotbeds of working class community spirit, and I really liked the way that you both showed how processes take place between those two poles. And again, on this question of when do people individualise like the failure to keep a home or the failure to become middle class or whatever, and when are there moments of kind of identifying the structural factors in those things? Like, do you have any further thoughts on what can enable or inhibit a more kind of community-oriented or structural analysis of what's taking place?
So I've got one from Inza, and then maybe we can take you guys a moment to... Yeah, exactly. All right, one more from Inza.
It's just a quick kind of methodological question about how to link the kinds of very localized sort of classical anthropological stuff that Matt and Anna do with what Jaime proposed to do, because when I was listening to your two papers, Anna and Matt, very compelling, and it's a sort of nice kind of empowering study of how activism can transform people's lives. But really, the bigger picture is so much more complex, and it's literally scales. And and pictures that people on the ground don't really understand. So, in my own research, I find a lot what you describe, people collectivize around a very localized issue, but the bigger picture, there's just confusion and no understanding. So methodologically speaking, what should our duties as ethnographers be? How do we capture the complexity, not just by focusing on the kind of very localized forms of collective action and their failures, but also the kind of bigger stuff? And how do we make sure that the bigger stuff doesn't end up being just theoretical or conceptual, but has an ethnographic core to it?
Challenging stuff. Okay, does each of you want to say whatever you feel like in relation to Catherine's points, and then also...
well, firstly, thanks, Catherine, for that really, really useful reflection. There's so much in there. Maybe I'll take the questions and then try and kind of fuse the response with some of the reflections on your comments. So, to Tobias's question about the kind of, are there aspirations for something beyond, or were there aspirations for something beyond, or is it just a kind of everyday resilience or resistance or surviving something which is being imposed on you? I think, in a way, this links to the kind of partnership board experience that Yasmin had, which was that in the early phases of this regeneration plan, there was the sense that this could be something hopeful, that this could actually mean, oh, we're going to get better buildings to live in, or we're going to have an upgrade to our living standards, and the local authority are going to help us with that. And that's what this partnership board was all about. It was about the developer, the housing association, because some of the tenures have been moved to housing associations, the council and residents supposedly taking a kind of shared role in this process. So in a sense, that kind of apprenticeship that Yasmin served by learning how the local state worked and learning about its entanglements with kind of private developers was really important in a practical sense, but it was also important in a political sense, because it was essentially a process of disillusionment for her, which is that she felt the partnership board went from being something that listened to residents and took their needs into account to being something which was purely symbolic, and where she only remained on it because she felt it gave her a stake in what was happening. It enabled her to listen to what was happening and to understand those processes, and which she could then, and she often described herself in this kind of, when I'm on the partnership board, I don't talk about the activism, but when I'm doing the activism, I can draw on things that I know from the partnership board. And she explicitly talked about how she wore these two hats, and then she used that knowledge to train other people up. And that was this buddy system that she developed, and this is how you need to talk to the council, you need to have a witness with you. All these techniques, all these tactics that she learned were critical. And so I think the aspiration did shift from being something which might be a hopeful project that they could co-author or co-participate in, to being something which was solely about survival. And yet, what I think that they discovered through this kind of experimental form of community leadership was a different kind of hope, which was perhaps a kind of hope grounded in something which they were kind of in the process of discovering. These kind of new relations, this new sense of being a collective. And maybe that links to Ryan's comments about what creates those moments where people feel that they... Was that your question about what makes the collective become a collective?
Yes.
So the reason I talk about affective leadership, which is just a term that I made up.
No, it exists.
Oh, it exists. Okay, well, there we go. And the reason I talk about commoning, I haven't worked these things through yet, and I'm not yet sure whether they're going to prove fruitful conceptually, is that I wanted to respond to a lot of the commons literature, which I think has emerged in response to Occupy and to the Squares movements and to these moments of resistance to austerity and to the financial crisis, where people seize public spaces and try and temporarily transform those public spaces, this kind of prefigurative politics. Because I think the danger in some of that literature is it fetishizes horizontality. And I think that in this case, in West Hendon, it wasn't horizontality that created the collective, it was leadership, it was a verticality of sorts, but a particular kind of verticality which was grounded in care and in listening and in incorporating people into and incorporating their needs. So that's, I guess, the contribution that I'm circling around is the importance of leadership, and this perhaps links into, maybe not methodologically, but at least politically, is that there is a need for it to be possible to scale up and to be linked to wider political forces and to understand those wider political forces. So if you take the recent case of the Haringey development vehicle, which was a much larger scale project in Haringey, where they were proposing to sell off it was a £2 billion sale to private developers to develop housing. There weren't even any affordances about so-called affordable housing. They managed to beat it because the council leadership changed. There was a grassroots movement sprung up, and it kind of, if I understand it properly, they kind of coalesced with Momentum, Jeremy Corbyn's kind of Labour Party project, and they managed to elect new people onto the council leadership, and those people voted against the HDV scheme going through, which is what didn't happen in West Hendon, where it was always 5 Tories and 4 Labour, and the Tories always voted everything through. So, yeah, I think I've talked too much.
That's fine.
But a sort of response to all 3 questions. But yeah.
Anna, anything you want to respond to?
Well, I mean, what you said, Catherine, I was thinking in relation of like the different levels that you mentioned. The different scales. And you mentioned the level of the household and the locality, the domain, the different domains and different phases, and all infused with these different forms of advice and care, and how like King operates at these different multiple levels. But then you mentioned about like the role of outsider catalysts, and it made me think, because you talk about like common areas and all this stuff. I didn't think about it for this paper, but actually one of the things that might also in relation to what Ryan asked, like in relation to the like making the community, what I found is that I focused on the inside, what's going on inside the household, but there were lots of like for example the common areas, hallways, lifts, the functioning of lifts, keeping the staircase clean, had an important role as well, not only in the making of a home, but also in how people will present themselves as respectable migrants or respectable people, or people that, okay, even though they defaulted on their mortgages, and they were, of course, self-blame is this is the first step that people have to deal with when they come into LAPA and become activists, because it's what Jaime was saying. Most people actually blame on themselves the fact that they got into debt. But these practices of, like keeping your hallway clean so that neighbors will not be bothered by me, who I'm an ocupa because I haven't paid, I'm a squatter because I haven't paid the mortgage or whatever, are also very important in building up communities or breaking communities. For example, people have to pay this maintenance, sort of collective maintenance for the building in terms of like garbage, rubbish, and cleaning it. And most of these people are not able to even pay because they don't have an income. They don't have any money. So they have been defaulted on those payments, which creates a lot of problems within the community. So it's beyond the household. I guess this making and remaking of home is also sharply cost-crowd by the fact that these people are unemployed, are living on benefits, have to deal with this welfare state and navigate all these welfare benefits that they might or might not get. So the unmaking of home is also influenced by the fact that now they have less access to benefits, less access to forms of advice that will actually help them and tell them how to navigate all of that. So I guess, I'm interested in the different sort of scales that you talked about, and maybe it would be important to make more crossings with all these different scales. The whole thing about time, there's a particular temporality in the process of not learning to become an activist, which that's an important temporality, but also in learning to accept and deal with the fact that your livelihood has been completely, basically destroyed. As Jaime was saying, one of the things about housing in Spain, well, it's everywhere really, but it's like this sort of trying to include low and middle income class people into the housing market. For migrants, as I was saying, this was very important, not only because it was a promise to become middle class, but also to become like inserted and become like Spaniards, But I guess that it's funny because in terms of the temporality of eviction, and studies on temporality of eviction, they actually show how it's not only the passive waiting. I mean, in the case of people resisting evictions, it's a classic. I mean, it's like the importance of active waiting becomes quite relevant. But there's always this sort of thing in the back of people's minds and everyday realities that the future is cancelled because of that. There's very little possibilities for them to actually think about what the future holds, because they are very aware that the system has basically just screwed them over, which may be something that links to incest. They are at least, and this, I know this is a minority, I work with activists who are really aware of the structural conditions that actually put them in the situation in which they are, which is not the majority of people. But they know, in different levels, but there are people that know how Goldman Sachs dealt with their mortgages and they sell the different packets. It's like the financial knowledge that they have is, some of them, it's really complex. So they do know what's going on outside. But nonetheless, even though they're not aware of how this is linking to the ways in which they won't fix the wall, because what for? I'm just gonna let it decay because I don't want to invest. But I think that maybe the link methodologically speaking is actually, I don't know, I think it's there. I don't think we have to, maybe we have to give people more credit about the way in which they know. I'm not saying that you're not trying to patronize, but people in this case, they do know about the structural conditions in which they got into debt. Maybe the problem is us in order to translate, like how do we translate that into, I don't know. I don't know how to do it.
Can I ask? Yeah. Okay. So, have you finished it? Yeah. So I've got a little question which I forgot to ask earlier, and that is, sort of does tie, I think, Jaime's paper together with Anna's, and that is to say, Jaime is talking about various processes that are grinding away, largely without people's real knowledge. And I sort of wondered whether the difference between Anna's people who had their homes unmade when they just couldn't be bothered to fix the curtains, and the fact that they suddenly started having an interest in making them again because they joined La Paz, is that partly because they became aware of these processes grinding away in the background? Is that actually the definitive tipping point between having their home just unmade and just thinking, oh, I can't, there's nothing I can do, I just got to wait, and suddenly thinking, right, I'm going to become an active person partly because I understand these procedures which previously were hidden? It's just a kind of thought. I'm just wondering about that.
At least from what I saw, and this is like sort of the narrative of the movement as well, right? Once you become empowered by knowing how to defend your case. It's not harmonious, and there are lots of conflicts within, but it's definitely, because even though they know that they might lose their home, that maybe they won't be able to renegotiate the mortgage or whatever, in the process of these collective forms of advice and talking to other people, they do, at least this waiting becomes active, and they understand more structural conditions that are affecting them and then act upon those conditions.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to say a couple of things. First thing about time. The relation of credit with time is a complex debate. There are many things you can say there, but getting in debt or taking credit is about the ability to plan your future, to abandon proletarian condition, so to stop living hand to mouth. But what's interesting is that many people who are the majority, who still owe money to the bank or have a mortgage, they describe having a debt as a race against time. So you try to repay as fast as you can. In fact, as soon as you have some savings, you just take them to the bank because you want the mortgage to be shorter, and you want to pay as few interest on the mortgage as possible. And people really do describe it as a race against time. And then it's interesting also that in La Paz, all of a sudden, this is about stories where time has collapsed. I mean, time is completely suspended. As you said, there's no future anymore. But for some people, I mean, they literally talk about not having a sense of time anymore. Like, and the interesting about La Paz, and I'm surprised that really nobody has written about this. Maybe you have in your work, and because I've read parts. But in La Paz, there's something. La Paz it's the most powerful housing movement in the world, and what makes it so powerful is that people have remade. It's not just that they've remade their homes; they've remade their lives. Like La Paz has become their main activity in their life. Like they lost everything. Many of them, like, divorce, separation. Some of them have lost their children, not only their homes. And La Paz is what basically becomes the only alternative to what they had before. And they rebuild time within La Paz, and it's a different. And then the question is what's going to happen in the coming years? Because I mean, the kind of activism that La Paz demands is extremely demanding. You really give your life to it. And then the other question that Insa was mentioning, and I think it appeared in our discussions. So as Anna said, the question of the question of knowledge about the structural problems, and we know that La Paz is a clear example of how you politicize the guilt and the individual problem, and you make it a collective problem, or you common it in a way. But recently, a good number of people have mentioned that technically La Paz has managed to achieve very little in terms of, for example, the mortgage law is still as demeaning, and it's an insult to human rights. I mean, you're still in debt right now. If I had a mortgage and I stopped paying my debt, the mortgage, I would be in debt for the rest of my life, still after losing the house. This hasn't been changed because the right wing, which is in power, has basically has listened and is working for the banking lobby. But on the other hand, it's very interesting. I think that if you look at it ethnographically, you see, or just if you talk to the people in La Paz, there's a clear success of La Paz, which is that it has managed to change the common sense. I mean, to make this unacceptable for most people, but also particularly what I really appreciated from Anna's paper is that for people in La Paz, and you showed this, a success is when somebody who lost everything all of a sudden, as they say, is empowered and decides to struggle. And that for them, they describe that as a success. You don't need, and that's what you were pointing at, you don't need to, the fact that you haven't managed to change the law doesn't mean that, what's the aim of a movement? Clearly for La Paz, in fact, La Paz was invented to change the mortgage law, and that was it. It had to disappear after changing the mortgage law. It wasn't a permanent union. It wasn't. But then it became about doing that kind of everyday work where you fight to change people's mentality, and it has to do with a subjective transformation. Every subjective transformation, every time you manage somebody to change from guilt to fight, to know who owns their mortgage, what bank, in what part in the world, in Europe, and then to go to the bank and struggle to get rid of the debt, that's a success for them. And in that sense, I think there's a key shift in this question about the knowledge there's a question about knowledge. So in La Paz, many people who go there to their first assembly, they quickly gain knowledge about the structural problems. But that in itself even though they call it empowerment, knowing is empowerment, is not really, that's not the qualitative shift that La Paz is about. I think that the real shift is when people experience, they embody the struggle and they go to the bank and they yell at they protest. I mean, there has to be some kind of action, like literally embodied, physical, knowledge in the abstract of how the system operates, can be a form of awakening, but consciousness, to speak in classic terms, you see it clearly in La Paz, only happens the moment people actually take action and take control of time again, of their... But because that's a problem with activists, especially with us, like so-called middle-class activists, that we try to... Don't you see? I mean, you try to share and explain how things work, and people know that, but it's not until they actually take action that that kind of subjective change takes place. And La Paz is successful because of that. Other movements try to do that, other unions, and they're not as successful because it's hard to make that shift where that knowledge is embodied through action.
Okay.
Sorry.
We've got a few more, like 5 to 10 more minutes. So yeah, these don't have to be questions, but observations or whatever. So I've got a bunch. So yes, Catherine.
Just Matt's paper really jumped out to me. Some work I did in Leicester a good few years ago. The resonances between the importance of a leadership using the technologies of the state, the tools that the state gives local actors to then use to then resist against the state. I mean, the resonances, I think you could see across these different contexts is so striking and across different times. But I wanted to ask, because we've talked about time, but place in all of this, in that I'm thinking of home not just in terms of material objects in the house, but also the place, the relationships that you're constructing home. And I could see this as a thread through the papers. So Matt, in the activism, they're reclaiming ownership of their space, their common ground, their right to live in their houses, but how are they also creating a sense of place, a community and connection through place, and reconfiguring that place as a place of belonging. Then if you think about the middle classes, they can't stand still. They're also precarious. They have to, it's not guaranteed that they can buy a house. But yet, so often, and stuff done in London, I'm thinking Michaela Benson's work, where you buy that house is really important. And from the middle class, so how place becomes configured in those kinds of choices and dilemmas that people think they've got. And then I was thinking about the home, so the migrants in your work, Anna. I was thinking about, so we've got this real sense of that activism, as in, forming a sense of place outside of the home, and that becomes another home, but also because they're migrants, a diasporic sense of home, how these objects are connecting the here and the there, and that's another sense of place coming into, and actually your work, I mean, I'm fascinated by the ethnicity, the class, so it's not just commonness, it's, all this stuff on conviviality and racism, you could tap into that as well as this narrative of financialisation, all the rest of it.
Thank you. Giacomo?
Yeah, I wanted to jump on yours and especially Insa's question about awareness of structural processes that create this kind of situation or lack thereof, because I think this is really crucial, not only politically, and I think this is a huge problem nowadays, but also in terms of our terms of knowledge production and understanding of social reality. And I like the fact that you put it in methodological terms, because we need to find ways to articulate. I mean, also these 3 papers, which I also was really interested in, but they should be one paper and put together this more kind of ethnographic understanding of the local reality with the structural processes of transformation and like unequal relations that Jaime was talking about. And I think something crucial that emerges there is that we're eventually bringing, after 30 years, the state back into these processes of like financialization. And this was also apparent in Anna's, I think, paper when I was struck by this exception of the Ecuadorian people, which were kind of protected by their own state, whereas you understand that in the background the other ones are not in many ways. So the absence of the state is I think, really crucial. I'm a bit of an old-fashioned anthropologist, I think. I think Glucksmann extended case analysis in methodological terms is something that can really become useful for us to explore all the scales that you were referring to, from the locality to larger processes, not only in like simultaneous processes happening, but also I think it's very important to look also at historical processes of transformations. And this, I think, becomes really also eventually politically relevant in terms of understanding the processes that can transform micro-realities.
Thanks. Okay, so Chris?
I also wanted to respond to Insa's question in a provocative way, in a slightly different way, and that's to ask, is scalar thinking the problem here, if this is the question we want to address? And so I'm outing myself as a geographer here. And I mean, geography as a discipline has been dealing with these kind of questions for decades now, I guess. And one alternative, I won't spend time necessarily elaborating critiques of scalar thinking, but one alternative would be more kind of topological imaginaries that don't insert a series of spatial differences. So I was actually thinking, I'm sorry I don't know your name, but the question about place obviously through to mind Doreen Massey's, particularly her later work on thrown togetherness. We've seen a lot of work on assemblage thinking that helps try to think that what elsewhere might be thought of as the global and the local together. John Allen's done a lot of work on kind of acting at a distance. I've tried to use topology to think through kind of debt relations as they become kind of enfolded and the different extensiveness. And I think, too, the kind of other reason it appeals is because it relates to this question of time and different temporalities. I was kind of really sort of provoked by what Catherine said, not just about the durabilities of the kind of ordinary people, but the durabilities of the state and capital, and that kind of constant work, which I do research in Ramallah, the kind of work of the Palestinian Authority and the banking industry there to kind of make credit and make it stick, and to kind of make it circulate. You know, I mean, there's huge amounts of work there that ethnographically you can get at in exactly the same sorts of work.
I just wanted to quickly react to what Jaime said before about the type of demands that certain types of activism puts on people, and perhaps connecting it with what kind of definition we might have of effective leadership. My question is, do you think an act of conversion is exacted on these people? Do you think that is what it amounts to? And I mean really the kind of gestalt switch that you have if you convert, I imagine. Like everything makes sense and the knowledge you have actually enacts action, demands action.
You mean convert to like the knowledge that you...
That's similar to religious conversion. That is what I mean. Which also, I imagine, my understanding of that is that then you can make reference to a higher instance that produces enough energy for you to tap into. Do you see this as a kind of quasi-religious power that is active?
Okay, so sorry, does anyone else got something? Yeah, okay, so I've got you, right, so Antonio, and then I'll go back to you.
Yeah, First of all, thank you for this really interesting and stimulating discussion. Mine is just a comment. I would, so to say, to express sort of uneasiness with some comments that came out, especially concerning a comment of Catherine Alexander on Matt's paper about the ambiguity of certain forms of empowerment that runs the risk to enforce the neoliberal idea of for the people they have to start caring for themselves. So the uneasiness, it's about the fact that are we always running the risk to read these forms of activism as a way of enforcing neoliberal ideas, so that every time people care for themselves, they are in a way confirming, reproducing, enforcing neoliberalism. And it is quite paradoxical in the way I've been listening to Matt's paper, because Matt's, in a way, what the idea of commoning, I linked as following his reference, like De Angelis and others, to a tradition of thinking that has been based on the idea of creating institutions from below, or if you wish, non-institutional spaces, national space. At least this is the what the autonomist political thinking and practice of to which De Angelis actually belongs, being practicing and pursuing. And this is something that I find really paradoxical, and I don't know how and to which extent connecting this to the different scales to which these political activists can be read beyond the fact that they are enforcing neoliberal idea that it's good that people actually learn to care for themselves.
Okay, so I've got one more question there, and then we might just, if there's anyone who wants to wrap up, they can do so. Otherwise, we'll have lunch and we'll continue discussion afterwards. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question is kind of a question in relation to what has been said by Insa and Brian and Tobias, and it draws on what you guys mentioned as the conceiving of community, this kind of way of thinking.
Can you say a little bit louder? Sorry.
Yes. The community comment made by Insa in relation to the complexity comment, and I wanted to link that with what really struck me in Matt's presentation, that before the people you were studying never tackles the 5 clusters of people you identified, never tackled what was a shared problem together, but then there was a momentum in which a person with their list came around, and that changed quite a bit. And then I was thinking, like these moments exactly in which like the different publics, what we would otherwise conceive of as, okay, this is one community, that this like trigger of the intersecting publics, what is it that happens that it changes, that these what kind of groups mobilize together? So yeah, that was my comment.
Okay, does anybody have a burning desire to answer any of those questions? Not that
it's not burning.
You don't.
I've got a lukewarm desire.
Okay, Matt's got a lukewarm desire, so he will now answer.
Well, so to refer to the last question, and also the question about place, some of the stuff that I didn't have space to include in the talk. So when Laura and people who spoke about Laura's involvement in the organising described what had happened, so how did that shift take place? One of the things they talked about was the fact that they started going in each other's homes. So before you might have a cluster of friends, and particularly among the older council tenants, they had a cluster of people that they knew, and some of them were family, and they would have been in and out of each other's homes a lot. But most people said that they would just say hello to each other in the street. When the meetings started happening and people started explaining their situations, and they tried collectively to understand how their situations differed and how they might relate, people then started taking responsibility. Right, particularly Laura and Yasmin started taking responsibility for each of these different problems. But through the course of over these meetings taking place, people started speaking to each other outside of the meetings, and then started saying, well, okay, well, when you get your letter from the council, come over and we can go through it together, and we can call them together, or we can go down together. And people describe the fact that I'd lived here for 5 years and I'd never been inside Lucy's house. Mm. So that moment of entering an intimate sphere was crucial to attaining a sense of place that I think was kind of created through those social relationships. So generating deeper relationships with people deepened the sense of tie to the place, which perhaps, certainly in the case of the private tenants and non-secure tenants, they didn't necessarily feel they had before. And actually this links to the question about conversion, because Laura described, because she was facilitating this whole process, and it was her skill as a facilitator and as an organiser. Her background was in social work, and there's a whole backstory to that and how she kind of came to community work, which is important. But she described facilitating this process as like going through a spiritual awakening, because there was suddenly 300 people who were talking to each other and were doing things together and were affecting one another in important ways. And yeah, I also work in Venezuela, and I've worked with political activists there who are all very religious, and they often draw analogies between becoming political and the way that it feels like becoming religious. There's a certain, and I think there's a danger in oversimplifying those analogies, but there's definitely a sense that, yeah, if you think about Anna's informants and the way they come to think of themselves and their homes and their relationships in new terms, yeah, that could be called a spiritual or religious experience, I think.
So we've gone 10 minutes over, but never mind.
Can I say a very short thing?
Yeah.
Because Catherine put it on the table, and I think somehow we're struggling with that. And I would say two fast things. One is that I think that horizontality is compatible with scaling up. And La Paz is an example, but it's an example of the problem is La Paz tried to scale up. It didn't achieve structural change, but then what counts is that at that level of horizontal community relations, it still has an effect. It still has successes there, and that's what it allows it to go on. Even though it's an example of how you scale up the struggle, but at the national scale, so far unsuccessful. And the other thing is community and anti-neoliberal projects are compatible too. The question is, if those community projects are politically oriented in the sense that they have an awareness of the structure, and so, for example, you can have two, like with the new co-op movement or the new solidarity movement, so-called, you have a lot of truly like solipsist initiatives that really are about ensuring the future of your family and your community, and that's it. But what's interesting is when, and there are many cases of that, when you have communities that, bring that micro change, which is a success in itself, together with an awareness of what needs to be changed at the structural level. But that needs to, that means a lot of sacrifice in terms of struggle and political organization. But I agree with Antonio that commoning or the production of communities is perfectly compatible with anti-neoliberal projects. The question is how they are framed in the practice, which is what you were more or less saying.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I just wanted to Antonio's comment that you said, as far as I understood, how these practices basically reflect the neoliberal sort of self-sufficiency and self. Yeah, I mean, I agree, but also I think there's another side of the story. As Andrea Mühlebach has shown, it's actually neoliberalism also enables these practices of care, ethics of care that didn't exist before. So it's kind of like it's contradictory in a way, because on the one hand, yes, it's pushing people to take care of themselves and perform these self-fashioning practices in order to become autonomous, and individuals. But at the same time, I think it has enabled the possibility to to think of communities and these sort of self-fashioning practices. I mean, I think maybe it has also to do with the fact that in such precarious conditions, people are facing others and their needs of others, and therefore it's not only reacting for self-preservation purposes, as in a liberal way, but also in relation to the needs of others. So I guess neoliberalism has enabled this as well, and not many people. The critique is there, but I think by looking at, I mean, she makes it really clear in her book in Italy.
Okay, listen. You may now continue the discussion. We are going to have lunch. Thank you very much to all of the people who spoke and to the commentator. And we've got until 1:30, and then we are going to resume.